Welcome to Theological Insights again with myself, Mr. Jay Bora, and please feel free to subscribe and leave a comment. Today, I want to really just briefly talk and explore around a subject that's impacting a lot of people around the world, communities and groups and individuals in a wide range of settings, and that is the subject around racism and how God views racism and how we experience racism. But to begin, really, I just want to define racism, which includes prejudice, and it's about discrimination. It includes discrimination or antagonism by an individual or a community or an institution against a person or people um, on the basis of, they say, the membership, or could be a particular racial or ethnic group, um, typically one that is a minority or even marginalized. It's also, I'm just reading a definition, it's always about the belief that different races possess different distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as either inferior or superior to one another. And obviously, we'll be talking about some of this. And that's also an issue around race, is the process by which systems and policies, actions, and attitudes create inequitable opportunities and outcomes for people, for certain people of certain groups. So the question really being, and the challenge presented to us as individuals, is around all these particular areas. I mean, when we're defining what racism, what are the root causes of racism? Is it inherent? How is it reinforced? How do we reinforce racism? And I gave some areas around some of the definitions about it. Talks also about including people that are excluded. It talks about harassment, people that are disadvantaged, humiliated. These are experiences people have. People are disregarded, degraded, and treated very badly. We can probably experience that in workplaces and even relationships, and oftentimes people in certain racial relationships or groups may be experiencing these kind of areas. One might not discriminate against, say, their own color if they're in the same relationship, but there could be certain prejudices, which is opinions that we form. This is very, very interesting, give and take. If people particularly say they have a belief in God, a review about God, then to what extent are some of these prejudices or beliefs that we have generated, as I said, or coming from some root cause, or underpinned, as I say, also by things such as stereotypes that we have about people, labels, or some of the negative experiences we take into another relationship. We can talk about learned behavior. We can talk about grooming and all these terms and our perception about these groups prior to embracing the relationship into somewhere else. And this is very important because, give and take, say from an employment point of view, we can talk about racism, where we say the Equality Act about treating people fairly, and etc. Race Relations Act in certain institutions, people are targeted again. And again, the thing being is that when we talk around God in terms of how he sees mankind, how we've been viewed, and how we view God in this light, I think it liberates us more because of the fact that when we're talking about God and his creation, does God see race? Does God see, or is race or racism a social and political construct which in essence is meaningless? It provides some distinction, at the same time a lot of segregation. On that matter, for example, we could talk about Indians and Africans and Chinese and Black and Jamaican and all these different groupings. To what extent is there a crossover? But to what extent there is a large distinctions based upon people that are targeted from particular groups, so white and black, we can talk about them areas, and other people targeting other groups for that matter. However, what seems to be reinforced again, we could talk about racial extremism or racial terrorists. Again, I talked about inferior and superior views that people have against certain people, whether that's to do with power or money or status, not knowing, not realizing, people don't realize that when we came to this earth, we came with nothing. We were never defined. We didn't know our identity. We don't know who we were, for that matter. That had all to be explored and been taught to us. I talked about learned behavior. A lot of stuff had to be taught to us in regards to who we are and the meaning of life and our purpose had to be generated. But far as, say, racism is concerned, and over the years, it's an area that we probably all experienced growing up. We've all seen or heard, read about. But how does God see this, and how are we supposed to be dealing or engaging with certain aspects, give and take? That if God is a central figure point and he sent messages around the liberation of these areas, though people do use and justify narratives for that matter that God was selective in terms of the Jews or the Israelites or other groups and that people that matter, or he was pretty much dealing with black people, say from the Old Testament point of view. However, it would seem as though when people are using the argument of God or a Bible for that matter to create further segregation based primarily because on a view, a translation, or an interpretation of something. Yet by the same breath and the same reason, people are trying to harmonize people. It's about how you're being treated, about equality, using people's religious people or figures to promote that. Or in modern days, Nelson Mandela, we talk about Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all these individuals. However, there are still significant failures across the board far it comes to comprehension and execution of some of these areas. Because if we talk that God is someone who has certain key attributes and characteristics in a particular nature, then to what extent is that reflected, even of his thinking in terms of our thinking pattern and our thought processes? To what extent is that influenced or governed by God? And we see that very, very scarce to a certain extent in certain places or countries or cities with a sense of pride that may exist for that matter, one against the other. When we see this country may say it's more powerful in that regard than the other country. So we see a certain trait and characteristic which not really, does not actually demonstrate to us the nature of God as far as human interaction is concerned. The narrative or the ideology, which it is racism, that is adopted and said that this particular group far exceeds that particular group, yet not recognizing there are verses even in the Old Testament talk about God blesses people and the rains on the just and the unjust, because God is not biased in that regard. God does not discriminate in that regard. God does not have favorites in that regard, because he has put each mankind on the earth. And by reason of that, we have been taught what group of people or language we belong to, knowing again at the end of the day, we have our own choices and our own preferences. But as far as racism is concerned and the impact it can have on communities in different ways, if we were to divulge deeper into God's mind and God's thinking and the way we've seen how we read it, we find there are various distinctions made. There are various areas of aspects that this is why mankind has to put policies and laws into place, and I quoted somewhere earlier. But yet, by the same breath, they cannot live by them. Because the problem is, the failures of mankind is this, that why are we trying to adhere to policies to address issues when the area that needs to be addressed or needs to be explored is inherent? It's in the deep core of our fabric. It's in the deep core of our thinking. It's in the deep element of our psyche. It's in our conscious bias. It's all rooted and deep rooted inside of us, which is why there has to be a radical change, a radical reform that needs to take place if change, effective and successful change, is to be brought about. But in order to do that, you cannot have people who pray, for example, and praying to God. One minute you're praying, and you get back up, and you seem to want to attack somebody from a different racial group or racial background. And by that action alone, or that indication, tells me that you've not actually come in contact with God, the same God that you're praying to about equality and being equal and loving each other as brothers and sisters, for that example, and yet you seek to want to target a particular group. There seems to be a big contradiction there. So far as racism is concerned, and some of the areas and the negative attributes that it has, because there's nothing very positive about racism in any form. Because they could use again the argument of God, that's how God made me. Well, God didn't actually make you to embrace any sociological constructs in that regard. These were taught by human individuals or people in society through systems and norms and values. When God made us, arguably, we were just made as a human individual. It's where we were placed to that extent, and then to what extent we were shaped by that and them experiences, and we're told who we were. The question is, has God ever mentioned any particular race? And there's another argument, say, for example, in the Bible, and I'll quote again the King James Version. Does he mention black race or the Chinese race or the Jewish race or the next race? Does he mention all these kind of individuals? Now, if there's a theological term, because this is about theological insights, in terms of a reference, this is a very common saying. There's only one race on the entire planet that God actually recognizes and identifies with, and that's we term as the human race. That is very interesting by reason of the fact that that is the one that God is actually dealing with. So when God views us, now we're talking about perspectives. So when God views us in terms of our blood, our composition, our bones, our structure, our DNA, we're made very similar. Human beings are made almost very similar indeed. apart from a distinction, though in our blood there are certain elements, there are distinctions by reason of identification of human beings. But that unique aspect of God's creative power has made us in such a way that we all have two arms, two legs, two eyes, etc., etc. And then we go about, excuse me, functioning the way we do. Now, it seems as though the groups or the segregation or the inferiority or superiority from one group or one person to another is based upon social aspects or economic aspects or some other aspect for that matter, or something that you were taught just by the reason of the color of your skin for that matter. So therefore, these definitions, sometimes they don't help situations or governments or societies or people in workplaces. So when you're sitting, for example, in front of an interview and say it's predominantly white and you're from a black or Asian or other background, by reason of that, you could be argued you're already at a disadvantage. You're already disadvantaged. So therefore, though people have to work in the context of a law to promote equality, say in a job interview, the question wouldn't be they have to adhere to the law, for example, for that matter. The question would become then, are their own prejudices blocking that? Are their own prejudice in attitudes to other groups or other individuals, or do they feel a sense of insecurity? These are the areas and aspects that God teaches us, say that's written in his book, that shows to us about change, about view, about love, about recognition, about treatment. This is the one about treat, there's a saying in the Bible, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. So if that was demonstrated, say, in a job interview, surely you want the same opportunity given to yourself as the next person. Surely you want to share some of that success with somebody else. And that is very key important to liberate, destroy, damage, starve racism, if I can say that, from that particular perspective. However, people want to seem to hold on to something and feel that's safe and comfortable to do so. Yet there is a risk to holding on to that. Yes, there is a danger in holding on to them kind of views. It's quite damaging in the long run. And this is the challenge that we've got, because when God is dealing with mankind, he's trying to get to the core. I told you about the root cause earlier, to address the area of where that is coming from, where that root cause is coming from. However, we seem to feel comfortable, or we feel it to be acceptable, or it seems pleasurable for us to reinforce that notion of racism in that regard. Although we may not want to engage in a physical act of violence per se, but we do want to see somebody else do that on our behalf. So in essence, you're still sharing some form of delight in that. There's a saying in the legal world, when you talk about criminal nature, criminal by association. So by association of certain things, and this is how God views certain stuff, we will still view something in a particular light, though we have not done anything to say sort of contribute to that. But we have done something else to reinforce that within ourselves. So therefore, it's interesting to note that when we're talking about the racism and the challenges that we've got in regards to that, there's a verse in the Bible, which is Jesus' disciples writing in the book of Acts of the Apostles, that talks about how God has only made one blood of every single nation on the planet. I'm going to quote this, by the way, in chapter 17 and verse 26. It says, this is what they're speaking when they were teaching around unity and creation and people and individuals and human beings. It says, and he hath made, which is God, one blood of all nations. I'm quoting here from the King James Version. For to dwell on the face of the earth, and have determined the times before appointed. So this is interesting to note for anyone that may have a prejudicial view or racial view or superiority view of themselves. He says, and he has made of one blood of all nations of men to dwell on the earth. So we see there's no prejudice there in God. There's no discrimination there in God. There's no favoritism in that regard. Having made one blood, when God judges people or deals with people, he deals with them according to, say, a sin or a transgression that they may commit, not because you're black or because you're white or because of this whatever reason. He deals with it primarily because of the nature and how you violate a particular law or something that you should not have done. That's how God views it. That's how God sees it. When we're talking, this is about theological insights, people to consider that other groups are not, in essence, inferior. Just because somebody may be born in an upper class doesn't make them any better than someone born, say, in a middle or lower class, so to speak, because given takes these distinction of classes were not given by God himself. They were constructed by society and people and et cetera, to put people in certain brackets and distinctions, and also based upon, say, other aspects which I mentioned earlier on. But far as God is concerned, and which is probably the key agent, and anybody seems to want to use God as their argument, or God is someone who can reinforce these negative areas which I just mentioned, we have a very weak argument simply because God actually contradicts what they teach as far as racism is concerned. And so the superiority is concerned. Give and take, when we have a judgment day, and we will get to that at some point, he's not going to judge you on the base because you were black. It's the views that you held, or because of your Asian, or what that matter, or you're white. It's because of the views that you held, and to what extent them views were damaging, to what extent them views that you had were dangerous, were not liberating. We did not promote that sense of righteousness or that holiness of God's character and nature. Yet you were professing the same thing as though you were representing God. Or for example, in churches or mosque or temple, or whatever, you cannot have, say, a white church and then you have a black person come in there, or a Hispanic or next person, and you treat them differently. So in essence, you are still practicing some sort of religious or institutional racism, and at the same time quoting again from a holy or religious book to say as though God is on your side. I think we need to consider again and re-explore again the depth of our views, and challenge these views in light of what God has said, challenge these views in light of what God has revealed to us and what God has shown to us. And then from there, make some sort of a plan or plan of action to change some of these views. That's what's going to change societies. That's what's going to move people forward. Now, they may resist that because there's always a resistance to change. Anything is changed is very powerful because we're talking something that is entrenched, something that we've been taught for years, something that may be traditional, that we've been held for years, many years. And this is the challenge, for example, what Jesus had when he came. Called out these disciples from different backgrounds and had prejudices, by the way, against people who were non-Jewish, and he had to deal with them individual and the prejudices against other people. However, over the course of time, over the period of time when he challenged some things and he was demonstrating by his own actions, you can see the influence that he had managed to change them. So that's what I'm saying today, in regards to the insight around racism from that perspective. We need a central figure point, somebody who can show to us and demonstrate to us they were coexisting with a lot of different people, and at the same time, they're practicing what they preach. They were harmonizing things, breaking down barriers, breaking down all these areas, destroying them from the root cause of where they were coming from. And only God knows the root cause of where these things come from, which is why Jesus came to liberate people's thinking in that regard. He came to change the views and perspectives, give us a more healthy one, a more positive one that can change societies, peoples, and communities and workplaces based upon that. And sometimes a person may become a victim of something, but yet at the same time, you being a victim of something, you are also becoming some sort of ambassador for something. We see that's demonstrated again with what Jesus taught and what is written, saying in the Holy Book in regards to all that. So in essence, God gives that person that strength and the protection and guidance to do so, though sometimes it's going to be very difficult to do so. So therefore, this is really to challenge today people who hold racist views to say that God has given them to them. They've learned it from God, and they're actually reinforced it. And I've clearly shown, at least to a certain extent, and I may go into a little bit more depth within the individual case studies, that God does not, by reason of the fact of his moral nature, his character, his personality, his attributes, demonstrate to us that God is a God that actually does say that racism or concurs or gives an inclination to say that racism is acceptable in any way, shape, or form which it comes, knowing the damage that it has caused. And we've seen that again reflected at the beginning of creation when he made mad Adam and Eve. And we see that there, those that believe that argument, they were there, they were harmonized, and then everything else, because of the change, the transgression, the nature, the people going on their own views, and we've seen it decline. So therefore, God had to put something back into place to bring it back up again and do a U-turn from the direction we were heading for. So really, this is just to consider that racism, in essence, is nothing to do with God. It's not inspired from God. It's not influenced from God, and it doesn't come from God on that basis. So I hope that we can get an insight into understanding this a little bit more further, in a bit more depth. God does not deal with segregation. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe.